Hello, everybody, and hello to Craig. Welcome to our second DevCon Fireside chat with a virtual fire. We'll have to use our imaginations. Welcome to DevCon, Craig.
Welcome. How are you?
I'm good. Talking to you from Zug in Switzerland today, rather than on the chair next to you. But geographic restrictions are something we're going to talk about today, and how Bitcoin helps us overcome them. So I want to focus on some technical and economic aspects of Bitcoin. And last time I asked you a few questions about a few design decisions that were made in Bitcoin and why they were there, and we dug a bit deeper into what some of them actually meant. I'd like to continue that theme with a few points from the white paper. I'm still 10 years later finding new things in the white paper and understanding things a bit differently to the way I did the other 100 times that I read it. But I want to actually start with a question of grammar, actually. It's a question that I've been asked quite a few times, which is there's a data structure in Bitcoin called the Merkle tree and another smaller version of it called the Merkle branch, and then there's the Merkle proof. It's named after a cryptographer, I believe, by the name of Ralph Merkle, which would imply that it is meant to be capitalized. And this has been a question of much debate over the last year for me in particular. So I'd like to throw it to you for the definitive answer.
Okay, so yes, you should capitalize it as a name. And if we want to go into the full sort of grammatical correctness, because it's referencing a name, we should have single quotes around it. But that's pulling out the old predicate logic type naming rules for syntactic logic. But if we're doing the grammar correctly, it should be a capitalized Merkle. And if you want to show off and be totally wanky, you can put single quotes around Merkle, like no one ever does anymore, because no one has learnt this stuff since the 50s, apart from me. Well, and I'm sure people will argue that I've been around that long, but I haven't.
If we're going to enforce that, I have a lot of documents that I need to update, and it sounds like a job for grep rather than a manual task.
But then again, you're also in information technology, so no one expects you to even know how to use a comma.
I saw an interesting comment on Twitter the other day, which was about the obviously posted by an Australian commenting on the updated Bitcoin documentation, starting to use the Z form of words like decentralized or centralized, this or that. And they called it the de-Seppification of Bitcoin documentation, which is something.
Yes, the de-Englishification, yep.
Yes. Okay, so let's move on to Bitcoin design decisions. Again, in preparing for this, I had another detailed look through the Bitcoin white paper and picked out a few things that have stood out to me over the last few months. It won't surprise anybody to know that I probably look at the white paper at least a few times every week to clarify certain things. And first, we'll focus on section 5, which to me is one of the standout parts of the white paper, because it defines what the Bitcoin network actually is, as well as defining what a node is. And one of the steps in running the network says, and I quote, "When a node finds a proof of work, it broadcasts the block to all nodes."
Yes.
Now, it was only a few months ago that I noticed that word "all" in there, but I think it actually has some pretty profound implications. Does this imply that nodes not only should be connected to all other nodes, but that they're not responsible for relaying other nodes' blocks?
So what we're meant to do is actually ensure that the network is a small world network. It should be a near complete connection. So we're not going to go into graph isomorphisms or any silly mathematical stuff like this, but if you don't have a complete graph, it's still okay. I mean, you should forward if it's there to forward, but it should connect to practically everyone. So the process is you receive a block, and then you just do a quick check. Anyone you're connected to, do you have this block? If they don't, then they should be able to go, yep, I want it, and you should then send it. And not everyone should send everything everywhere, because why receive the same block 50 times? Remember, if you have the block header, you have from one node, you have sort of everything to prove the block everywhere else. So once you have the block header, you can prove it. I mean, so yes, I want to check the block header multiple times, but I don't want to check the whole block multiple times.
Yeah. So a well-connected Bitcoin node would be taking responsibility primarily for getting it to all of the other nodes, wouldn't it? Because it's in its interests to do so.
Correct. And if you are sending your node out when you've discovered one, you want to get it to as many nodes as possible, as quickly as possible.
When you're receiving a block header from another node, is it as in a block that you haven't mined, some other node has mined it? Is it interesting to you to know how many other nodes have seen that block and how fast they've seen it?
Yes, it very much is. This allows you to work out the connectivity and where you should aim sending first. Now, there are different methodologies in sending on networks. Although it says send everywhere, you could blap it out to everything equally. Now, that could be a problem in that some slow networks may actually degrade you getting it to large networks. So nodes will start working out that this guy has 30% of the network. This guy has 10%. This guy has 2%, but he's really fast. This guy has 5%, but he's on a terribly slow dial-up modem. And they will start working out how best to send around the network. So optimizing the network traffic will occur, but that's only going to occur if you can start working out, well, what connectivity this guy has. Are they responsive? Do they forward? All sorts of things like this.
Okay, so if you're looking for the fastest path to get your block accepted by a majority of the network?
Correct. You want to get it to everyone, but what you want to do is, I want to get it to this 60%, then I want to get it to that 30%, then that 10%. That's only one example. Maybe it's that 30%, then that 30%, etc. But you're going to work out for your particular set of connectivity, your particular set of network computation power, what is the optimal methodology for my company to send everything around the network, and it's going to vary. That's part of what I'm actually doing with my PhD at Exeter at the moment. I'm trying to work out, decompose the graph from the node point of view, so that they can create a formula to say this is how we should be connected. We need extra bandwidth to China. We need extra bandwidth to the US. Japan's fine. UK's fine. That sort of thing.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's interesting because we're actually the Bitcoin SV team is currently working on introducing the concept of connection priority, so that when you have a block to broadcast, you can actually choose which nodes to focus your resources on first. And we had planned that primarily so that people could draw a distinction between Bitcoin nodes on the network, the ones that are actually producing blocks,
and merchants and home users,
other people that are connected who are essentially sort of draining your resources. There's no reason for us to use our resources sending them blocks when we actually should be sending them to nodes first. But it sounds like there's
it will even stop DDoS attacks, because if you just start connectivity between all of these random nothings, whenever someone does an attack, then you're still able to process all your connections. You
Yeah.
still want to have a methodology for getting transactions in, of course, otherwise you're not going to be able to earn anything. But equally, you want to be able to sort of make sure that the majority of other nodes see your block as quickly as possible so that they don't go off and discover another block that competes with yours.
Yeah. So we had a discussion a little while ago about terminology again, and we're talking about people who are connected to you who aren't actually nodes. Now, they may well still be running the Bitcoin SV software, but they don't fulfill the definition of a node because they're not trying to produce blocks, or they're not producing blocks rather. And for a while, I've been calling them blockchain listeners, but after that conversation, I think you and I settled on the term blockchain block subscribers rather. Do you recall the rationale behind that?
Yeah, I don't mind using block subscribers because they're effectively not sitting there like people seem to think in a mesh promoting this block going around the network. What they're doing is basically sitting there and pulling information off the network. So it's a subscriber model.
Would you envisage that ever becoming a paid-for model, a paid-for service?
Some yes, some no. What I see is there'll be a variety of different models. So where I've said about overlaid networks, there'll be different connectivity requirements for things like exchanges, real ones one day, banks, other merchant organization that need really fast access. I mean, potentially the Amazons of the world will eventually hook in, the MasterCards will hook in, and they won't actually be nodes. Potentially they will pay some nodes for better access. I mean, right now, you get people in exchanges paying for dark fiber connectivity into the Australian Stock Exchange, or Securities Exchange now. I keep calling it the wrong name. I know they've remarketed themselves like a decade ago, but old habits.
Would you?
I'll stop one day.
I'm starting to lose track. I've been away from Australia long enough now that name changes I don't remember. Would you ever envisage this sort of cloud of block subscribers ever being serviced by a node adopting, some other technology, like stuff a copy of the block in BitTorrent and you can all figure it out from there and get it yourselves?
Well, if you've got the block headers, you can work out whether a block's correct. So any way that's quick. So there's no reason why not. I mean, why have Dropbox or Google Store? Why does Google run a pile of hosted cloud servers? Why does Amazon do the same thing? It adds efficiency. So economic efficiency is good.
Yeah. I can certainly imagine S3 being used and abused for some distribution on the network at some point. So let's turn our attention to some more definitions, and probably one of the most important words in Bitcoin, the definition of a node. Section 5 of the white paper, I believe, is the canonical description of what it is.
Yep, it should be nice and simple, but it doesn't seem to be. Some of the simplest things always seem to be the longest and most horrible things for people to understand.
I know there are a lot of people who are actually clamoring for some clarity on this because the functions described in section 5, many of those functions are actually, well, I guess in the mining pool model, which is quite common nowadays, it's actually multiple actors that collectively perform all of those functions. So, I mean, the obvious example right now is a mining pool, which is what typically runs the Bitcoin SV software and builds the block templates, which then distributes them out to people who run warehouses full of ASIC units and do the hashing work rather. So where does the boundary of the node begin and end, and what should we call the other actors that are involved in it?
Well, the boundary is a difficult word. I mean, but if you have a group of sort of different entities who outsource part of their work, they're still going to be an entity. So the primary aspect of this is not, do I get proof of work and outsource it? Because those guys aren't really nodes. The guys finding hash solutions are just finding hash solutions. There's no difference to if they're doing it on rainbow tables. They're just
Mhm.
checking very quickly a lot of rainbow tables. So it has to be the person who is the active mind, the coordinator. So who is actually deciding which transactions go where, which order, and how the block is constructed? They're the ones who actually set the rules and set who gets paid. If you think about it, they make the rules on who gets paid. They make the rules on the mining pool getting paid, any network providers getting paid. So he who has the gold, golden rule.
Yeah.
Yep.
The very first nodes on the network were actually making use of outsourced services. For example, an ISP had to carry the transaction traffic from one node to another. And this isn't really any different in that
Mm.
sense, in your opinion, is it?
No, not at all.
Okay.
Um, so, I mean, between Telstra and TPG and a few other ISPs, um, I didn't run my own, and even if I did, then there'd be a backbone connectivity point. It wasn't dark fiber around the world to everyone who wanted to connect. So
But
the
it
world's,
almost sounds like it's more of a legal question than a strictly technical definition.
yeah, I mean, where do you draw the line otherwise? I mean, I didn't have my own solar power. I had electricity lines that 90% of the time worked properly, apart from a horrible backup generator occasionally
Yeah.
that was stinky and noisy. So tried to get the power working properly.
We've got another section of questions on just that topic, actually, some
Hmm.
alternative ways coming up. So I'm going to go out on a limb here and say out of section 5 there are 6 steps.
Hmm.
Step 2, each node collects new transactions into a block, which
Hmm.
implies also that it's validating those transactions. This is probably the heart of it. This is what
Mm.
the actor that is performing step 2 is the one that you would probably define as the node.
Well, if you've got someone collecting transactions, then they're also choosing who gets paid.
Yeah.
So they're going to choose. Um, I mean, think about it. If you do that and you're outsourced, you could chuck in your own transactions that um, for the mining reward.
Yeah.
I mean, where's that go? So, uh, mm,
Okay.
I mean, contractually, yes, you could sue people, but it's never good to give people the opportunity to get themselves sued.
So we've been talking in terms of nodes here.
Mm,
The other common term that is used to refer to these particular
mm,
actors is miners.
mhm,
Where is that term appropriate? Is it the node operator? Is it the hashes? Is it something else?
mm. Um, that's going to vary. I mean, at the end of the day, the sort of controlling mind, the point that decides how the block's constructed, what transactions get in, what size the block they're going to work on, whether they stop at 1 gig or 10 gig, whether they um, want to reject anything that's not Catholic, like certain people in Bitcoin's history. Um, all of that is really the sort of controlling body of a particular node. Like any organization, you can form partnerships and um, You can form corporations and trusts, and you can form businesses, joint ventures, all of these different aspects together in how you sort of distribute that over time. None of that existed in the early days of Bitcoin. So until 2011, well, end of 2010, people started playing with mining tools, but really 2011 on. Then it was just you ran a node and it was a little home user experience or a small company in one area. But after 2010, it got no, sorry, after 2011 on, we got to the point where people started creating alternative structures that they could run business as, which I hoped would do a bit more commercialization, and I didn't quite think of the hijacking that occurred. But I mean, the irony there is everyone's looking at distributed developer groups, saying, like you were talking about with governance. Few people seem to actually know or want to know anymore that the Bitcoin Foundation was actually first registered before Satoshi left.
I didn't know that.
No, it was actually registered in 2010. That's why Satoshi is actually a life member.
I see. Does Bitcoin Foundation still exist as an incorporated entity?
Sort of. The only way to put it is, quite frankly, a shit show. The whole concept was it was meant to be a steward to govern the protocol, not. But
as in, it was
I mean,
supposed to play a role in the block size debate and in result.
oh, there shouldn't have even been a block size debate. I mean, that was the whole point. There should never have been a block size debate. It should have just happened. It was just a limit that nodes could change whenever they want. And instead, a group of developers started this whole, the community rules, which, I'm sorry, how does the community give you any feedback? Other than Van der Waals and Voorhees and a few of the early guys sat there and went, the community has told me I've got my community consensus now. They want to do exactly what I want to do. It's amazing how the community always does what I want.
Governance by developer decree.
Oh no, it's not a decree. It's like when there's a papal bull. I mean, it's the word of God tells them, or something. I mean, it just comes down from all high, and they just know the will of the people.
Yeah, well,
it's like democracy in Soviet Russia. You can vote however you want, as long as you vote Stalin.
Well, Bitcoin governance was actually one of the topics I was going to get to, so I might jump forward to that since we've already opened the hornet's nest there. When we came up with the Genesis spec, you were actually part of this process in terms of reviewing the terminology, etc. We defined, I guess, 3 categories of things that the software itself, the Bitcoin SV software, enforced using code. Now, enforced using code doesn't imply that is actually the rule. It's just you can code. You can build code to try to express any set of rules. And we divided it into 3 categories. There was the Bitcoin rules, there were the consensus limits, and then there were the local policies. Now, the Bitcoin rules is what we defined as things that were meant to be immutable and never change. That's the definition of the Bitcoin protocol. The consensus limits were things that probably should change, but they required some agreement from miners to emerge in some sense. And that's things like the block size limit, the consensus, the maximum amount of memory that can be used by a stack when a script is executing. Things that basically, if there were no limits, would enable anybody to reasonably trivially force a node to crash. So they're designed to expand. And then, of course, there's local policies, which are individual to a specific node. Anyone can change them anytime they want. There might be some consequences or risks to doing that, but they're essentially there for miners to have their own individual control without having to deal with consensus. So are you still okay with those three categories, and is there anything to add?
Yeah, I don't mind doing it that way. I mean, where people sort of miss some of this is there's a difference between changing the protocol where suddenly it doesn't work without changing the software. If you have to go around and make everyone upgrade and change their SPV client, then that's a no-no. If SPV keeps working, then that's your first test. Now, the other side where people got it wrong with like 1 meg cap and that sort of test, it should have never really been the test that they made it, is it's a unilateral contract. So if I put a sign up saying, I've lost 3 dogs, if you bring back my dogs, I'll pay you $100 each, then I can't force someone who's found 2 of my dogs to go out there and look for the 3rd one. They can go, bugger this, I've got 2 of your dogs, and you find the 3rd one yourself. The same way with mining. I can't force them if they've been paid to take through transaction fees 100 transactions. I can't say, but you must take 101. They can just go, bugger it, I don't want to work harder.
So you make the case then that miners actually have the absolute right to choose what they mine, what they choose to mine, and what work they
do. Under the caveat that if they drop a block that other miners are going to accept, either they lose those fees, or if they do something a bit wacky in constantly rejecting all non-Catholic transactions, then all the other miners will reject them, and they'll continuously orphan blocks, and that miner will end up losing a lot of sort of income and probably go bankrupt.
One scenario that's been put to me before that I'm not sure that I have the best answer for is if a miner mines a particularly large block, doesn't another miner have an incentive to ignore that large block because there's a whole lot of transaction fees in that block that they could try and mine a competing block and get it?
Yeah, but they're going to be doing it after the first miner. So, I mean, think about it. If you have 30% of the network and the other guy has 40% of the network, and you discover a block first, you could say, well, he's got 40%. But the problem there is you actually have 60%, because if you get it distributed to everyone, it's going to end up, you have that block and other people accept it.
So what is it about the Bitcoin model that would stop a tragedy of the commons situation where a miner has 30% of the hash rate, mines a block, the other 70% all decide simultaneously, I'd be better off rejecting that block because I want to try and get the transactions? How would that sort of scenario play out? And is it even realistic for...
No, it's not really realistic. I mean, all it would do is fragment, and they'd have lots of little blockchains and no one would earn any money. Now, the difficulty is that you're assuming that they can take their money straight away. But the 100 block maturity level means that you have to actually get other miners to build on top of yours. So remember, you can't spend until it's 100 deep. So if you're going out there and kicking all the other miners off, then how are you going to do that?
Yeah. So if you got 20 evenly distributed miners and they all decide to start just mining their own blockchains because they don't want to let anyone else have any transaction fees, eventually some pair of miners are going to start mining each other's blocks, get longer, and the SPV clients will just ignore the other 18.
Exactly. Yep. So even if you've only got 3 miners at 30% and 1 at 10, and that 10 just hooks onto one of the 3 miners, then eventually they get longer, and the other two 30%ers lose out. So, I mean, what are they going to do? They're going to form a consensus together, and et cetera, and it all comes back to a big consensus.
So at the end of the day, the model actually makes. I guess it's one thing I've been fond of saying about Bitcoin is that the Bitcoin makes the default behavior the easiest path, or rather the path of least resistance is the one that is the best for the network as a whole.
Yes, correct. You just set up the economic rules, you make it most effective to play the game and not to cheat, and go from there.
Yeah. Back to governance for a moment. This is a question from me as part of the Bitcoin SV infrastructure team, and probably from some of the other people that have to make decisions about what we do. And in fact, it's a thing that has come up recently. Who should node developers be taking requests from, specifically with regards to the policies or the default policies that are implemented in the nodes? Because we are aware that setting of defaults actually does have some degree of influence, and it's an influence that we made some efforts to remove from ourselves after the Genesis. In fact, we quite explicitly said that in a message to the miners after Genesis activated.
Well, it would be good to set it so that the miners have, the nodes have their own control and they can work this out together. You don't want to see the miners colluding. I mean, that's the natural state of every business, of course. Old Adam Smith said that anytime you get two business people in a room, they'll start colluding about how to undercut the third guy. But at the end of the day, what we want to be able to do is allow the miners to have sort of open competition, but equally sort of not any special underhandedy things to cut this guy out. I mean, everything has to, that's why it needs to be open. So as long as everything remains completely open and without issues, then not a problem.
Okay. So I think almost all, there might be one or two exceptions, almost all of these configurable options, I guess, policies are configurable by miners at this point, and the one or two that aren't, we are actually working on making configurable. But the question is really, we have to at some point choose default settings for these sorts of things. We did go to the extreme when it comes to the consensus rules. There are only two left in Bitcoin, which is the maximum block size. Sorry, I might be mistaken, it might be more than that. But there are two kind of critical ones. And we went to the extreme length of actually refusing to set a default, which means that you can't start a Bitcoin node without choosing those settings yourselves. That was quite extreme, but it's not really practical with policy settings because there's quite a lot of them. That would make it an incredible burden. So in changing default settings, like how should we as a dev team go about doing that? Our approach has been to informally gather a consensus of miners by listening to what miners are saying.
This is where the Bitcoin Association needs to grow into a proper commercial organization. I've mentioned, I mean, I've been a member for ever and a day of the IEEE, right back from when I did engineering in ancient history for half the people listening to this who probably weren't even born. But the IEEE model is actually one that I find, either that or the ACM. The IEEE has a lot of good sort of professional processes, and that's one of the things we need to do. We need to start having business interaction, mining interaction, as this grows and commercializes, the same way that the internet, you have the internet sort of meetups between DNS people, between the standards bodies, between the major companies. People put in RFCs, which aren't standards, but they're treated that way. So all that needs to develop, which should be a function over time of the Bitcoin Association, which I try and prod, but I don't want to kick into shape and get there. So I want to hopefully have it develop. I mean, I don't think half the people who read it even realize, but the Bitcoin paper is actually on a early IEEE publishing template. So.
That's why some of those look familiar then. I think it's actually almost the first conversation I ever had with you was the first time you raised IEEE, and of course I'm familiar with it because my brief stint at university was engineering. And you'll be pleased to know that one of the aspirational targets for the Technical Standards Committee is to model itself on organizations like IEEE. So we're getting partway there. But yeah, okay. So that is it's a business layer function essentially. Determining
That's correct.
what the backlog should be for the development team. Okay. Well, that helps us with some direction on how we should go about doing things a bit more in the future. So I want to jump back to the topic of SPV because I know it's dear to your heart, and it's something underdone in the past, and we've been doing a lot of work across the whole ecosystem, and others, many people have been doing a lot of work in trying to realize the SPV model in its reality. But I want to look.
I mean, just to interrupt, I mean, I think part of the problem was it became too easy just to leave the software alone and not build out, which I should have really taken a more active role in the past in this one. I mean, we've got to have our own, the whole block to validate. I mean, I keep forgetting not everyone has studied cryptography or hashing at a detailed level, and explaining to someone that the secure hash, the SHA-256 hash of the block is just as secure as the entire block, to a lot of people is counterintuitive. So, I mean, trying to say that this little 80-byte thing is equal to this 2 terabyte thing, people, no, but it is.
I think we've got to get better, and that's a broad cross section of people that the comment is targeted at. We've got to get better at explaining that because it is one of the most fundamental of Bitcoin.
Yeah, I mean, the thing, people go but there can be collisions in SHA, and what if it's broken, and what if, and you get all these counterfactuals. And the whole point is, if SHA is broken, then Bitcoin's broken. So, I mean, that's it. You've answered your own question. If the sort of SPV header is not secure, Bitcoin's not secure. Full stop. It's very binary here. There's no, you lose a little bit of security. You don't. It's either 100% functional or 100% broken. It's very ASPI. It's like me. It's binary. There's no middle ground. It's black and white. Gray is just lots of little tiny pixels of black and white mashed together, and you have to look closely.
Yeah. Okay. If you zoom in enough, you'll always get your binary response.
Exactly, because then you hit the photons.
Aren't you lucky the foundation of the universe is quantum in nature?
Exactly. Keep telling people this one. But...
So Mike Hearn was probably one of the first people that ever really got SPV to any sort of degree, and for a really long time he was probably the only one.
Yeah, and I think that's probably some of his frustrations too, because he went out there and actually started building all of this, and then everyone says you're doing it wrong. I mean, Yeah.
But it's literally been with us almost since the beginning, because Bitcoin J, which we still use in nChain today, we've rewritten some large chunks of it. Was the
I
first
know.
that approximated an implementation of Bitcoin, SPV Bitcoin.
Hmm.
Um,
I mean, this is partly the irony in that people making my work into a religion have taken, but Satoshi didn't do this. Um, well, I mentioned in the white paper that it's meant to be there, and I do say I haven't got round to coding it yet. That doesn't. So if I said this is how you're meant to do it, but I haven't coded it yet, you don't need to wait for me to do every bloody thing on earth. And yeah, I mean,
well, why did you need to? If Mike went and did a lot of the work.
exactly, that was the whole point. I didn't want to do everything.
Yeah.
I mean, I had all these other things I needed to do, and I still do. So sitting there answering every question doesn't really.
I miss Mike. I think it was one of the towering figures of Bitcoin's early history, and he certainly did a lot of the hard yards in working out how to convert all of the Indian nightmares and on the Java side, without which I would probably have lost a lot more hair.
Yes, I will do the sort of whack myself with the ruler for that one. I know that's always been a big problem, which is the typical. I mean, ironically, I quote Mythical Man Month effectively in the original source code, and yet I don't put all the requirements of what I've actually quoted. So, I mean, that's my own hypocrisy there in saying that you need to do X, Y, Z and referencing that I know this and then not doing it.
Well, you might be surprised to know that I've recently made my peace with Little Endian, and that I've actually come to prefer it for certain applications, even inside Java, which is natively Big Endian by default.
Hmm.
So that's a long and extremely nerdy conversation to explain why I feel that way.
Well, I mean, I think part of that comes down to the platforms. I mean, uh, Sun always chose one particular Andean state, and of course, Java um, originated from Sun. Then Oracle, of course, merged with Sun. And I think some of that happened just because they wanted to be the opposite of Windows at one stage. But I mean, I'd actually say that, but the reality is I can't because Windows actually goes back even further. And for those who remember, Windows, in its current form anyway, the NT4 ORN, was birthed out of VMS.
Hmm.
And I liked, I have a background in VMS.
Hmm.
Um, so I got torn in the middle because I worked on both Solaris machines and VMS machines, which were DEC, and DEC ended up becoming sort of the foundation for what we have as Windows. The only problem was I don't know how the hell Microsoft took a working bloody proper operating system in VMS and made it into Windows. But I think they got every good bit of VMS and hit it with a hammer.
Yeah. You're talking about the deep dark past. I remember VMS, and of course, if we're
Mm.
talking about that, there's a topical Vax joke that we could be making right now, but I'm not going to steer right clear.
Yep.
Right. Well, I mean, you've opened the door, so basically, it's because of Terranode and the fact that we want it to be able to run on commodity hardware, the vast majority,
Hmm.
which is Little Endian
Mm.
by default, and we need to do a lot of mirroring data. And it
Hmm.
turns out that even Java does that pretty damn fast with native instructions if your data is Little Endian to start with. So
Hmm.
that's the, the secret behind my nerdy revelation.
Mm.
So getting back to SPV, it is the model that is intended for the vast
Mm.
majority of users of the Bitcoin
Mm.
network who interact with the network.
Hmm.
Skipping forward to 8 billion, and by that time it may
Mm.
be more than 8 billion
Mm.
people, which might actually imply a lot more than 8 billion devices, will need a copy of this 80-byte block header that arrives on average once every 10 minutes. How do you think we're going to go about distributing those? Because distributing to 100,000 users 80 bytes is a different ball game to sending it to everyone on Earth.
I mean, you've mentioned a number of peer-to-peer protocols, and there are some good ones out there. So eventually, I think we're going to have to look at something like that. It needs to be some sort of peer broadcast media. Structured overlays will also be probably part of it too, because we want people to not have to search and to find all of this quickly, potentially just even subscribe to a push model where it goes everywhere. It's really unfortunate that unicast is not publicly available. That would be super cool and all the rest. But I mean, there are ways around that. There are ways to actually get unicast over public networks, but it just means a hell of a lot of coding and doing everything ourselves, because no one makes tools to make it easy anymore.
So fundamentally, I mean, broadcast is the model. So what about radio? Could we use mobile towers to broadcast block headers?
Yeah. I mean, this is the only sensible way of, like we've mentioned, Blockstream. The only sensible thing they could have done would have been having their Blockstream satellites do this, except that's really an expensive, stupid way of doing it the way that they have. If you had LEOs, low Earth satellites, and giving it internet, yes, but you're better off hijacking a little bit of background bandwidth over 5G, or making an agreement with mobile carriers. In the future, if this gets big enough, then it just becomes like background to the internet.
Okay.
So,
and you can cross that, check that in the background with service. You just periodically check the latest blockhead.
For instance, if BT over here sort of had connectivity that was paid for that way, then equally they'd probably want to have a update service. And all you'd do is update whatever you had from the last time you were connected to 5G. And so it might be a 2 meg download. And 2 meg downloads over 5G. I mean, that's assuming you've been overseas and off their network for a couple of weeks. And not like everyone these days who then pays for a foreign SIM card and downloads it anyway.
So I wonder if anybody watching this caught the reference to the Blockstream satellite and is interested in approaching Blockstream and asking if they could change space blocks to space headers. Okay, I'll behave now. What about BitTorrent as a mechanism?
BitTorrent's not too bad. It's not the most efficient protocol. Funny enough, mentioning some of the other people, I've mentioned many times Mnet and the related protocols to that. That was actually our old friend Mr. Zuku there. He was involved with that before it fell apart. So, I mean, it's interesting that he runs around now saying how proof of work, Bitcoin's the first proof of work system, when he was working on a proof of work system a decade before Bitcoin.
And he just didn't know?
He must have known.
He didn't realize.
I mean, it didn't have the economics though. They reset, I mean, they had this sort of socialistic idea that if anyone gets too much money, they'll just reset the network.
Yeah.
Which makes it valuable. I mean, no one's going to get too powerful, because if they have too much money, we'll just reset it all and start again.
That happened once in Bitcoin.
That encourages people to invest. If I get too much money, they're going to reset my money, so I better put lots into this network.
But it actually has happened in Bitcoin history with the testnet because people started trading testnet coins and
Oh
the
God.
blockers got worried, so they
Yeah.
restarted
No, I heard about that.
testnet 2 and testnet 3 now, and the old testnet 1 is dead. Yeah.
I mean, this is the altcoin world. Oh, testnet coin. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned proof of work because it segues nicely into the last area that I want to cover with you, which is the topic of energy usage and energy waste. This is something that gets talked about a lot in media about Bitcoin in general. But
You know, the Earth wastes a huge amount of energy. 99.8% of the solar energy that just comes and hits this planet gets just flung out into space unused. It's horrible that this planet could sit there and waste all this power that could be used for productive means,
including running Bitcoin.
including running Bitcoin.
So I want to ask a question which might on the surface sound like I'm challenging a notion that that has been put about before. I've heard you speak about how it's critical to Bitcoin that the energy used in proof of work is used only for the proof of work and that it is essentially wasted on that and that alone.
Yes.
That word waste, I guess I want to go into because the expenditure of energy used to produce a valid block header through the proof of work process, it adds some weight to the trust proposition of that bit of data, doesn't it? Before that, it's useless data, but now someone spent a lot of money that they're going to use if it turns out that data is false.
So I've said many times that it's the peacock tail. And we could say that the peacock tail is very wasteful, but it also has value in that the peahen goes to the guy with the biggest tail. So to the peacock, you could argue that it's not wasting, even though it's wasting.
So could you also argue then that there is some value to the peahen in being able to choose the fittest of mates out of a selection, but being able to figure out which one is actually the one that's worth, I guess, trusting your future?
Exactly. So what it does is, I mean, it de-anonymizes nodes. This is, of course, what some of my opponents really don't like. The whole purpose of proof of work is to make sure that nodes can never be anonymized. You can't run them on Tor. You can't hide them. As a user, you can do all sorts of things, but as a node, you can never be secret, which means you're always under the requirement of law. There's no anonymity. There's no screw you, we can do whatever we want. I mean, the reality here is nodes are always a controllable entity. So very simple. You can always take legal action against them. You can always sue them. You can always have government come and raid their building because they're acting as a botnet. So that's what it comes down to.
And this goes to the property of Bitcoin that acting honestly will always produce a strictly better result for you than attempting to act dishonestly, because part of the downside of the dishonest act is you will get caught.
Correct.
You'll be known by everybody immediately and you're too big to hide.
Correct.
So is there any truth to the idea that a block header, before you've established that it has proof of work, is a piece of data that anybody could basically forge? After the proof of work is done and this peacock's tail, I suppose, property has been added to it, that data is actually a lot more valuable to people because they've got some basis on which to trust that the data is actually true.
They now know that there has been an effort made in validating, and there's something at risk.
So is it true to say then that the energy that is expended on mining that block hash solution, in some way, the energy transfers value into the data, and you're actually transforming the energy itself into value in some sense?
I don't know if you'd say you're transforming it into value. I mean, it's part of a work process. So putting on my engineering hat once again, work is transformed energy.
Mm.
So you take power, the electricity, and you transform power into work, and work has a productive use
Mm.
by definition.
Mm.
If you're just running around idly for no reason, then it's not work. If
Mm.
you're doing it to exercise, you're doing it to win a race, then it's work.
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, um, it is a proof of something that is creating value.
Mm. It has this interesting property in crossing geographical boundaries that energy might otherwise not be able to cross so easily or efficiently, though,
Hmm.
doesn't it? I mean,
It does. So one of the things we've discussed is sort of where you put energy devices. And with the ability to very simply send a small update packet that just has part of the header, you can distribute the hash solving and the ordering of blocks separately. And for instance, if I have a facility, and this could be distributed even more, I could put right on the internet sort of hub point where I collect all my blocks together and send them out to other miners. One of the main sort of routers, like in California, for instance. But then I could have a simple ISDN link that's intermittent back to somewhere in the middle of the Sahara Desert, and that facility could be using solar energy to run these machines that find the hash puzzle, and then very quickly and effectively they just send, this is the winning hash, and what you need to put it together, and then the remote unit constructs it all together, sends it out, and earns their money.
and this essentially allows us to make use of energy that would otherwise be inaccessible to us, because transmitting 1,000 miles or 10,000 miles over
Mm.
high voltage power lines
Yep.
incurs so much efficiency loss,
Hmm.
where you can actually just use it at source. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I was going to ask you before, when we were talking about the different actors, actually, what the right term is for the people who do the hashing, but I suspect after that conversation, the answer is contractors.
Could be part of your own company. I mean, a branch. I mean, it could be a partnership. It could be all sorts of things. But yes, it's a subcontractor, most likely.
Yeah. Okay, well, that brings me to the end of our questions, and I think that we're
Hmm.
probably running over our time slot, as is normal for these sorts of things. So thank you very much for
Hmm.
joining us again, Craig.
Yep.
And this brings us to the end of day one of our DevCon. We've got
Hmm.
more things
You're welcome. Yep.
tomorrow.
Hmm.
I'd like to close with one last question, which I guess is more for the app developers, and many of the people who'll be watching this
Hmm.
today. The work will never be finished in terms of building the Bitcoin SV ecosystem, the infrastructure, the companies around it. But
Good. You don't want it to finish.
well, no, we get bored, wouldn't we? And then
Exactly.
yeah, and then we'd have to retire or I don't know, go fishing or take up some other silly hobby. Yeah. So I don't think I'm ever going to ask you the question, are you happy with the state of Bitcoin? Because I don't think the answer will ever be yes. There's always going to be more to do.
Always be a caveat, yeah.
What are you happiest about in terms of progress over the last bit of it?
Oh, that
What
we
do you,
are actually making progress, to tell you the truth. Um, so that we're developing, that we're growing, that people are starting to use Bitcoin, make apps for Bitcoin, experiment. That people aren't sitting there asking me what I'm doing, and saying, how do I do it? But rather actually trying to learn themselves.
yeah. And I think that is testified to by the fact that we actually have people here at this DevCon trying to
Mm.
learn more about how they can interact with Bitcoin, make use of the core infrastructure and the tools. So, all right, we will draw a line there. So thank you very much again.
You're welcome.
Dr. Craig Wright, and we will see you at another event very soon, no doubt.
No problem. Okay.